Okay, so maybe there's been no sound and we've just had an awesome discussion for the last 20 minutes and you didn't get to hear it.
Oh dear.
It's been a really big week, everybody out there in Facebook land. All right, look, we'll start again. Hopefully you'll hang out with us and we'll see what comes out of our mouths, because we're just chatting away anyway. So, I mean, I guess where we really started, shall we? Maybe we'll come up with some even new and better discussions now that we're going through it for the second time. Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, it is.
I wonder if it recorded the sound of the video. Okay. So we started off really, I guess, exploring why we now call it sexuality education and what the difference is between that and maybe sex ed that we would have heard used quite a lot. And we were saying that really when we talk about sex ed, it sets up this idea that we're just talking about the act of sex, a really heteronormative penis and vagina kind of reproductive style sexual activity. And it misses the really broad definition of what our sexuality is. And that's, our sexuality is something deeply personal. It's also something that's very social and cultural, and it's linked to our emotional well-being, our psychological well-being, our spiritual well-being, our social well-being, and our physical well-being. So sexuality is this huge part of us, and to just talk about it in this really narrow kind of way of sex actually does a great disservice to it.
And also when we talk about sex education, I think most people focus on older children, teens, later teens, and really one of the things that we have heard other speakers say during this month is that's often too late to start to talk about sexuality and sex education, because a lot of messages and modelling has already occurred that can give quite distorted views around sexuality. So we're looking at, if we're going to look at positive education, it's really something that starts right from the word go and goes across the lifespan. We're all learning all the time, but with young people, the earlier we start, the better it's going to be for them. And also to look at a whole range of environments where we interact with young people and have the opportunity to provide that environment. Yes, right through the school system from a very young age, primary school and even before, but also within families, within support networks, within peers. There's a lot of opportunities, as you're saying, to have those discussions and start that education so that we can look at sexuality across the board for people.
Yeah. And we are sexual beings from the time we're born to the time we die, and I think it makes people deeply uncomfortable to hear the term sex and children in the same sentence, but we're not talking to children about sex. We're talking to them about their sexuality, which means we're teaching them the names of their private parts. We're teaching them what does it feel like to be scared? What does it feel like to be happy? We're teaching them about setting boundaries and being able to say no to people, especially people who might have more power over them. So traditionally we've told children that they mustn't say no to adults, but we absolutely want children to be able to say no to people in power and to assert a boundary and know that they've got a right to safety. And I think when we frame it that way, it makes much more sense to people. So we do need to get rid of this idea that we're talking about sex from birth. We're talking about all the things that makes us human and that helps us to keep safe in this world, but that also gives us the skills to keep other people safe, because that's part of it, isn't it? There's a right, but
yeah, and it's all connected to our development of sexuality, and as you mentioned, a concept like safety. It's never too early to start talking about safety. What makes us feel safe? What makes us feel unsafe? Being able to listen to those cues and see those flags, having that sense of our own personal safety, and as you mentioned, what our rights are, but also as human beings, we have responsibilities that come with rights, and having an understanding of how we interact with other people, how we treat them, how we show respect. And all of that are things that we can start learning from a very young age, which will contribute to a healthier sexuality, but give us a better sense of who we are as people. And it's really that balance as we get older, understanding the rights and the responsibilities that come with that as well. Even concepts like trust, for example. From a young age, we can start to learn how do we develop trust with people, move away from the concept of we have to trust all adults or we have to trust all people until they prove untrustworthy. But actually trust is something that we can give and take and remove from people if they violate our boundaries. It's something that we can build up over time. It's something that we can give different amounts to different people in our lives, kind of really getting a sense of how those things develop in who we are as a person and how they will later impact on our sexuality and our sexual relationships.
Yeah. I think, yeah, it is those things like when we talk to children and we say, well, who are trusted adults, we give them a checklist of how you work out who a trusted person is. It's somebody who doesn't ask you to keep secrets. Mm-hmm. It's somebody that listens to you, that's there to help you out, that makes time for you. That for many adults, when they hear that, they go, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But we haven't traditionally taught that to people. And that's, we need to be able to give people that right of, and know that they've got that right to say, well, that person isn't trustworthy and I actually don't want to be around them. And that a lot of that ties into some of that gender narrative stuff too, because women traditionally, cis women in particular, have been taught to just go along with it, to remain quiet, don't upset the status quo. And we've seen it time and time again, and I'm sure many people have had those experiences when you're out on a date and it really actually doesn't feel safe to leave. That, we need to actually change that story around people have a right to feel safe and to leave and still be safe. And a lot more of that is about actually talking to traditionally cis men as the perpetrators of that violence and harm as well.
And so I guess that leads to the communication as well, having communication skills and being able to communicate effectively, having a sense of who we are and what we want and what's okay with us and what's not okay, but also how we communicate that to other people. That's a really important skill that is important in all aspects of our life, but is certainly going to come into play when we enter sexual relationships. And so that's another big learning skill that we can start very early. And another one that's coming to mind, I guess, is that connection to body. That can be a really tricky concept for a lot of people, and particularly for young women, that there can be a disconnect from body or there can be a rejection of body. There's a lot of judgment on social media, amongst peers, etc. And really kind of encouraging young people from a very young age to have some kind of connection with their body and understanding their body and understanding its privacy and its rights and how you treat your body and take care of your body, who has access to it, how you communicate, all of that kind of thing as well. That lots of examples we can use from a young age that come into play in our relationships down the track.
Yeah, and certainly tickling is one example of that around, if children are playing tickling games, the to respect a no when the child says no, which is teaching them that their voice matters, that they are able to speak up, that boundaries should be respected. So there's a lot of communication in that. Also, that to trust the feelings in their bodies around when they verbalise that no or that stop is a really good one. And as I was listening to you before, I was thinking that, bodies become unsafe, particularly when they're oppressed. Like an oppressed body is a traumatised body. And that level of disconnection is a form of protectionism, that when all the messaging is telling you that your body is somehow dirty or shameful or abnormal or societally incorrect, that there's that disconnection that happens, and it's incredibly hard to experience embodiment and safety in that body. So that from an early age too is something we can combat. It's, if we're waiting until people reach the age of consent and then suddenly go, oh, they're about to become sexually active, here's a whole lot of skills around ethics and respect and empathy, we've missed the boat. These things need to be, then we need to go back to them. I think they are present in our humanity and the way that humans move through the world, but they've been layered and removed and overlooked and brushed aside in favour of a whole lot of other things that maybe aren't as important. So really returning back to that and giving those skills from an early age. Yeah.
And you mentioned people reaching the age of consent, and I guess consent is a huge issue when we're talking about sexuality and sexual violence. But I guess it's also a recognition that consent isn't a concept that just relates to sexual activity, that it does cover a whole range of behaviours, and we can start to talk about and teach and model consent from a very young age, because it can apply to all sorts of behaviours that occur with young people around, from a very early age, around consent to share toys and consent to, you gave a good example about the eating.
Yeah, in the last live we did. With people of my generation, certainly, when you would sit at the dinner table and you didn't get to leave until you'd eaten everything on your plate. what that's teaching is that the feelings in your body don't matter. I'm the person with authority and what I say goes. And then really negative ways to teach people about their rights and their place in the world. Instead, if a child says, I'm not hungry or I'm full, then we can say, oh, it's really great how you're listening to your body. How about I leave the plate here, and if you're hungry later, you can come back to it. So awesome job. You've connected with your body and you're getting to know yourself really well. Just because I'm an adult or someone with power over you doesn't mean I know what's best for you in your body. And I'm going to listen to what you've said, and also hear some choices, because sometimes as adults we know that maybe they do need to eat a little bit more. Leave the plate there. They'll come back when they're feeling snacky. So I think starting to change the way that we parent is really important. Starting to change the engagement between adults and children is really important, because and I guess that's one of the things that came out of the Royal Commission into institutionalised child abuse, was that when you've got a generation where you're saying children should be seen and not heard, you've taken away their voice and their agency. And one of the findings of that report was that pretty much every single one of those children had tried to tell. They tried to tell, but nobody heard them, nobody listened to them, and nobody believed them. And it wasn't through their own lack of trying. Maybe they did it verbally, maybe they were communicating it in other ways because they didn't have the language. But we need to really move away from that from an early age, that actually children's voices matter. Disempowered, disenfranchised, marginalised people's voices matter. And all of that comes through sexuality education, because we can address racism and decolonise our curriculums. We can look at the gender narrative and inequality throughout society and throughout history. There's all these opportunities to unpack ableism, ageism, to really strip that away and get to what's at the heart of it, because what's at the heart of it is empowerment, and that's the foundation of consent, both hearing it and giving it.
And I guess part of that definition of consent then, and the examples that you're giving, are really about changing how we do look at consent, because we traditionally do tend to look at it as quite a passive thing, that until someone actually says no or fights you off or withdraws consent, then you assume consent is given. And we want to flip that around and look at consent as something that is actively sought, and look at teaching young people, how do you actually go about seeking support, seeking consent, and how do you ensure that you do have consent? What are the things that you're saying and doing to get active consent from someone? And that's really important, because I don't think that's discussed as much in our definition of consent. We have a legal definition, each state is slightly different, but we are looking at something that is about voluntary permission. But we want to take it to that next level, where we're actually looking at removing it from being a passive act to something that's quite active and enthusiastic and affirmative. And we have had some of our speakers touch on affirmative consent as well, to really look at it as a teaching opportunity to explore how we go about getting consent in a whole range of situations, which, with some of the examples you've given, demonstrate that we can do that in a range of environments from a very young age, so that we have the ability and the skills and the communication to do that, so that when it comes to a sexual situation, we're more inclined to look at what consent means in that environment. How do we go about seeking consent? How do we go about giving consent, withdrawing consent, and understanding the nuances of consent as well? Because I think, you're talking about unpacking some of those concepts, and I think that's really important with education as well, and around concepts like consent, that we often focus on, do you know consent is important? Have you heard about consent? And rather than actually breaking that down, what does it actually look like? How do you know if it's there? How do you know if it's no longer there? Understanding that consent can be withdrawn at any time. Consent applies to all sexual activities, regardless of if it's someone you've met for the first time, someone you've had an ongoing sexual relationship with, someone you've been intimate with for many, many years. Every activity requires consent, and really kind of understanding the concepts around that, like respect, for example. I mean, that's a great term. We use it all the time as a community. What does it mean? And really having the opportunity to discuss with young people, what does respect mean to you? What does it look like? How do you actually show someone respect? How do you expect other people to demonstrate respect to you? Because I think sometimes that's the tricky part. We know the terminology, but we don't always know the behaviours that go with it. And that's what we really kind of need to focus on in the education, because it's about understanding how we demonstrate these. Not that we know the terms, we've heard them, we think we understand them. It's about how we actually roll them out in our lives, in our own behaviour and our expectations of others.
And when you put it like that, the legal definition falls so far behind the definition that we should be actively wanting to use in our lives, that it's even a word like respect. For some people, lots of eye contact is really respectful. For other people, lots of eye contact is quite disrespectful. So, and consent is the same. It's really nuanced and it's really subjective. And I guess we do, like when we've done education with young people, and that they can say that a consent is a yes. It's, you know, a no is withdrawing consent, but that doesn't capture how complex sexual relationships are. And it is about, what does it look like to you? What does it feel like to you? And why do you want consent? Because you shouldn't be seeking consent just so that you tick some legal box. You should be wanting consent because it means that you understand that a human is a site of celebration and pleasure when they actively come to you with that celebration and pleasure, when it's affirmatively given, that pressuring people, come on, oh, okay. Like, why would you want to have sex with somebody who doesn't want to have sex with you? Why would you want to be intimate with somebody, whether that is for a hookup for one night or whether that's for a long-term relationship? That we need to raise that bar for everybody, not just young people, around why do you want consent? I want it because it means the other person wants it as much as I do. That this is somebody who's really willing and is absolute hell yes to my sexual journey, because that's the discussion that young people miss out on. And they, sadly, the main discussion that they get is from pornography. And it's, you know, you can be pro or anti-porn, but the point remains that if pornography is the only sexuality education or the only real life examples of sexual interaction that people see across the board, then we've left a vacuum where we're actually not showing how amazing and pleasurable, mutual and equitable sexual relationships can be. And I think that does people a huge disservice.
Yeah. And I think that's why we have to be open to those conversations, because they're occurring anyway. Young people are talking to each other. They're getting bombarded with messages through social media and the media in general. And as you mentioned, through pornography, there's a lot of education that is going on out there, but a lot of it can be miseducation. And so it is about being open to those conversations that aren't necessarily sex talks as such. It's not the biology of sex. It's understanding all the concepts around that and understanding the emotions that go with it, the respect that goes with it, the communication that goes with it, and having discussions not just about what's not okay and what you don't want and what the definition of sexual violence is, for example, but it's also kind of spending more time talking about healthy sexuality and, as you said, pleasure and joy, and understanding a lot more about sexuality and what people are comfortable with and what they're open to. And, you know, sometimes there's misunderstanding out there when young people are talking to each other. It might not be, or adults, very honest about what people are doing and what they're not doing and what is seen as normal. You know, it's really kind of opening that up for people, being able to have those conversations and explore those concepts and really kind of unpack what is right for them, what pleasure means for them, to understand that that is a normal part of sexuality and it should always be a part of sexuality. It's not about one person's pleasure. It's not about you having to fulfill one person's needs. That there's a whole lot of that goes along with having a healthy sexuality and understanding where you fit into that and how you feel about that and what you're comfortable with, and not making a comparison of what your friends say they're doing, what you see on pornography. Sometimes we kind of need to challenge some of those messages that are out there and those ideas that are out there. As you said, it doesn't matter whether you're pro or against pornography. There is a lot of misinformation in pornography. It does portray a very limited sexuality and sexual interaction. And so we do need to provide young people with the opportunity to be able to talk quite openly and frankly, to challenge some of that and to get perhaps a bit more realistic information.
Yeah, and you're so right. It's, you know, with no education, people will kind of work out which bits you rub to feel good and what you might want to put where. But all that other stuff is really hard to learn experientially unless you're going to learn it the really hard way. How do you break up and both feel really good about it, especially when you've got to see each other at school every day? How, you know, delete nudes of your ex on your phone. Those kinds of things do actually require discussion and conversation, and about how do we uphold ethics in our relationships as well, because it's not so simple, and technology has complicated that even more, as we've seen. But it's negotiating condoms. Like, it's fine to tell people you need to use condoms if you're having sexual activity involving a penis, but that's the easy part. The hard part is bringing it up with your partner, about having a discussion about your sexual health status, about it might even be for some people about where to access condoms or barrier methods. So there's all of that stuff that actually does require teaching, and we're quite happy to do it with lots of other subjects at school. But for some reason, when it comes to this one, because the word sex is in it, which kind of brings us nicely back to where we started, but when the word sex is in it, it's suddenly like, well, we're not very comfortable with that. But when we say, well, this is actually about communication, this is about respect, this is about really digging down into those concepts of what makes you a good human, and how do you engage with other humans in a way that does leave them better off. That's not you moving through the world causing harm to people.
Yeah. And I guess that also includes how you do that teaching, because there are lots of organic teaching moments. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be. Some of it will be lesson plans and sit down and have certain conversations, but there are lots of opportunities where topics will come up that will provide you with an opportunity to open one of those discussions up and explore that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And it could be something that happens on social media, something you're seeing on TV, something that they talk about that happened at school. So many opportunities. It's just about remaining open and being confident, and you may feel very uncomfortable with that, but feeling that fear and doing it anyway, and having those conversations and providing the young person in your life the opportunity to explore a little bit of that with you.
Yeah.
Because, and part of that, I guess, is the modelling too, modelling that openness, modelling that communication, modelling that respect. A lot of those teaching moments are through our own behaviours and what we model to people, respecting boundaries, etc., etc. So much of that is through the modelling, because we do know people are likely to be sexual at some point in their life. And we kind of accept that without really wanting to talk about that. And so the difficulty is that people can be more comfortable with the activity than the discussions with it, exactly what you're talking about. And so we need to kind of create a lot more freedom to have those discussions with the people we're sexual with, but with other people in our lives, with medical professionals, with counsellors. A whole range of people might be part of those communications and education.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a social change that we actually need to get comfortable with it, and it's time that it moves out of the shadows, because the problem is when we don't talk about it, that's where harm does occur. And some of it might be that it's come from misunderstanding or a lack of education. Sometimes it's through reinforced gender narratives that are this stereotyping and toxic masculinity that is playing out over generations sometimes. But all of those things can be interrupted with high quality communication and reinforcement. And those teachable moments, I think, are a fantastic kind of takeaway point from today's Speak Out as well, is that watch Love Island, put something on the TV and comment on it. Don't be scared to kind of call out things that are in the world around you. Ask your young person. So are people in your class watching pornography? It's best if you don't ask them if they are. Try and do a little bit of the othering technique. But there are so many opportunities out there to talk about relationships, even if you're not comfortable talking about sexuality in any more depth. You can certainly talk about the way that people speak to each other, the way that people interact with each other on the TV, out in the street. There's lots of ways that we can go about that.
Yeah, and as we've said throughout this, is that it's not all directly related to sexual activity. So also looking at teachable moments from a very, very young age, that looks at a lot of the concepts that interplay with sexuality. So there are lots of opportunities to talk about respect and consent and boundaries and trust and communication and safety. And so much of that we can start to build on from a very young age to hopefully contribute to educating young people towards a healthy sense of self and a healthy sexuality.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you very much, Kellie. It's always a pleasure speaking out with you twice. Thanks everyone for hanging in there.
Thank you.